All right, so what I'm going to be talking about is what I guess I've started to call multi-cause causal inference. That is a setting where there are a set of inputs in a system, and you'd like to understand how manipulating that set of inputs is going to affect a single outcome that you're interested in. So I'll draw some diagrams on the board to set up that multi-cause setting. But first and foremost, I just want to sort of make sure we're all on the same page for what I guess we could call classical causal inference, right? So this is causal inference where there's just one cause that you care about. So we're just going to call that causal inference. All right, so in this setting, we have some variable, I'll call it A, and we're interested in understanding how manipulating A is going to affect Y. Right? Now, when I say manipulate, that actually has, there's a lot of weight in that statement. I actually mean that we're going to reach into the system and think about switching the value that A has, right? And so I think that everybody who's taken a statistics course knows that, looking at this conditional distribution of the outcome given the cause, is not necessarily going to tell you, what the causal relationship between A and Y is, right? And so what I'll say that we are actually interested in, as P of Y given do A, and so this is using Judea-Pearl's notation for causality. I apologize to all the potential outcome folks in the room. I was trained in potential outcomes. But what we're interested in is actually reaching into the system and doing something to A, right? So we're going to think about all of our causal quantities as having this word do in them, right? And so why is it the case that this conditional distribution of Y given A, the sort of observational distribution, is not always the same as the intervention distribution, right? Well, one of the main reasons is that there are often third variables that drive both the cause and the outcome, right? So these third variables are often called confounders, right? And if you have a third variable that's driving both A and Y, then any sort of covariation between A and Y could either be explained by the fact that A is mechanistically changing Y, or by the fact that they're both moving together because there's some common cause, right? Okay, and so if we want to sort of think diagrammatically about what we'd actually like to observe, or what we'd actually like to learn, what we'd really like to learn is the conditional distribution of A given Y in the setting where the sort of driving factor is no longer causing A, right? Essentially, we have broken this relationship between U and A, between the confounder and the cause, and we are reaching in and changing the cause ourselves, right? Okay, but this is all that we observe, right? And this is what we'd like to learn about. Great. So our goal here is to write this non-observable quantity in terms of things that we can learn from this observable quantity, or just from this observable relationship here. And so I'm going to set up our goal here as non-parametrically identifying this quantity, So when I say non-parametrically identifying, what I mean is that we're not going to make strong assumptions about the functional relationships between these variables. That's the non-parametric part. And then by identifying, what I mean is that we are going to write this unobservable quantity in terms of observable distributions. All right? Great. So in the sort of classical theory of causal inference, there are a set of sufficient conditions that are, I think, the most commonly used. If you talk to economists, they may disagree, but if you talk to, say, epidemiologists, they tend to agree with this, that essentially what we'd like to be able to do is to just find all of these third variables that drive both the causes and effects, or the causes and the outcomes, and we just like to control for them, We'd like to condition or adjust for them. And so there are a couple of assumptions under which that strategy is sufficient for non-parametrically identifying our P of Y given do A, The first assumption is called unconfoundedness. And in this sort of diagrammatic world, what that means is that we observe these confounders U such that they block all backdoor paths from A to Y, right? So essentially, if we are able to observe everything that's a common cause between A and Y, then we can block all of the non-causal correlation between A and Y, right? And so, right, essentially what we end up doing, if we're going to use this unconfoundedness statement, it allows us to do a couple of operations. So the first operation that we can do is we can take P of Y given due A, right? We can expand it. So we're going to take an expectation over the distribution of U. And our unconfoundedness assumption, I'm going to put a star on this relationship here, allows us to swap in this outcome distribution, for an observed distribution. I should have an eraser with me, right? What's this do operator here? Yeah. The do operator refers to the setting where we have removed the arrow from U to A, right? So that's what it means formally, right? Intuitively, it means that we are reaching in and changing the value of A. Right? So actually, in particular, let's think about the setting where we actually have a particular value of A in mind, right? Under this unconfoundedness assumption, it allows us to move from this sort of hypothetical right, quantity here to an observable quantity. Right? Now, essentially, we just need to look at this regression function, right? And then take an expectation where we average over the confounders that we've observed, right? OK. So I'm just going to write this out as an integral to be super pedantic. Right? So this is the regression function, and we're going to be integrating it over this marginal distribution of U. Right? We'll go over the support of U, right? OK, so if this is the sort of operation that we'd like to perform, right, there's one thing that we need to keep in mind, right, which is that, right, we're integrating over all values of U here. So that means that we actually need to observe data that's generated by this regression function, right, for all pairs of values A and U, right? That's not something that holds automatically. And so we need a second assumption, which is positivity. I'm not going to be using super rigorous notation here. So I'm just going to say, right, probability that A is equal to A, given U is equal to U, is greater than 0 for all right, values A in the support of A and values U in the support of U, right? So essentially, right, we need to be able to observe this outcome regression function for all values of A and U, all right? So this is sort of like the classical theory of causal inference, right? And it says that essentially, if you observe this confounder, right, if you observe the confounder that blocks all backdoor paths, and if you have positivity, then you can perform this adjustment here, and you can actually learn what this intervention distribution is, right? All from observed data. So that's really nice, right? Now, right, the key problem is that usually, or very often, right, we don't observe all the confounders that can block this backdoor path, right? OK, and so this is where sort of the new conversation about multi-cause causal inference comes in, right? The question is, what can we do if we don't actually observe this confounder? All right, so let's move on here to unobserved confounding. Right, and multiple causes.
Just a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you say observe, do you mean know, say, the probability exactly of the value of A given the value of U, or do you mean we've sampled enough data that we can estimate this quantity reasonably well?
So in this talk, and thank you for asking that question, we're thinking in the sort of infinite data limit here. So we're thinking that basically any probability that generates data is a probability that we have in hand perfectly, right? So, right, in this world here, we have in hand the joint distribution of P of A and Y. And right, the question that we're asking is whether from this joint distribution here, we can actually recover this intervention distribution. Right, so this is all sort of in principle, whether we can recover something. And then there's sort of an additional step if you want to apply this, where you have to then think about how well you can estimate every one of these portions.
Could you bring up your QR code again? I was about to click on it.
Sure. I'm going to need to enter my password. Great. Cool. All right. So, what is this multi-cause setting that I'm thinking about, right? So I said at the beginning that, right, I mean, I think that this is something that's near to a lot of people's hearts, right? Let's assume that we're now in a setting where we have our sort of classical causal inference problem, but instead of just one cause, right, or one input, there are actually many inputs that we're interested in. So I'm going to have m inputs that we're interested in, right? And we think that each of these may be causing the outcome of interest, right? So we'd like to understand how manipulating multiple inputs here will affect the outcome. OK, so one might argue that this is actually a more interesting problem than this one, right? And furthermore, intuitively, if you sort of squint at this, it seems like maybe we can get a little bit more traction in the case where we don't have an unobserved confounder. Right? So just to ground this sort of problem here, an example that might work well with this audience, right? Let's take the example, right, where each of these inputs here is, say, genetic variant, right, measured as SNPs, right? Let's say this outcome here is some phenotype, say height or occurrence of cardiovascular disease. Let's say that this unobserved confounder here is something like population structure, right? And so, right, we might be in a world where if these SNPs are sort of very far apart from each other, where we assume that their occurrence in the genome is independent after we condition on population structure. Right. All right, so right, in this setting here, we'll make two assumptions. Right? The first assumption is the same that we made before, which is that U blocks all backdoor paths. I'm just going to say all backdoor. Right? And the second one we're going to make, which I just sort of, right, is that U factorizes the distribution of all of our causes, A. Right? So we have a vector of m causes here. When I write A, what I mean is, right, A here, we're going to define it as A1 through AM, right, causes that we're interested in. So when I say that U factorizes P of A, right, what I mean is that we can write the joint distribution of our causes A as being conditionally independent. Right, so this is k equals 1 through m, P of AK, if we condition on the unobserved confounder U. Right. OK, so right, there are, I think, a lot of models that make this assumption, a lot of techniques that are essentially designed to deal with data, right, under this assumption, right? So, right, the reason that I'm using this word factorizes here is because most factor models, right, correspond to this sort of assumption, where we assume that all of the covariation in the set of inputs that we care about is driven by some common latent factors, right? Such that if we knew those factors, then the rest of the variation would be independent. Is that fair? So some examples of models that operate under this are probabilistic Pca. Right? There are a number of matrix factorization models that also make this sort of assumption. And more recently in the machine learning literature, there have been a set of papers proposing a technique called the deconfounder, right, that attempt to learn something about this unobserved structure, right? And then make some progress in this setting, right? Okay, so some pipelines that make use of this sort of setting here sort of follow this sort of schematic, where the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to estimate something like the joint distribution of U and A, right? By observing a bunch of these causes together, we feel like we might be able to get some information about U, right? And thus we can sort of get a picture of the joint distribution of U and A, right? And the second thing we're going to do is, using something like P of U given A, we're going to adjust for U. Right. So if you ever, say, run a GWAS where you use principal components analysis and then control for your principal components, right, that sort of fits into this pipeline. All right. So the bulk of this talk is about why this sort of workflow is insufficient to recover the intervention distribution. All right, so I think that this seems like a very sort of intuitive way to try to recover the setting where we can actually condition on our unobserved value U. But as it turns out, there's sort of not enough. All right, that is not enough to recover the causal signal that we care about. All right. See enough MIA videos that. All right, switching to blue. All right, so let's take 3 here. We're going to call it limitations of factor models. Great. Okay, and so the main thesis here is that if we're going to use a factor modeling approach that sort of takes this approach to a causal inference problem, we are going to fail to achieve nonparametric identification. Right? And the way that we're going to show that we fail to achieve nonparametric identification is a technique called sensitivity analysis. So what we're going to do is we are going to take our model for all of the data here. We're going to show that there's an indeterminacy in our ability to recover the full model, the full joint model for U, A, and Y. We're going to show that if we perturb the model along that dimension that is not determined by the observed data, then our causal conclusions are going to change. Right? So we're going to call the set of causal hypotheses that are consistent with the observed data an ignorance region. Okay? So the entire sort of goal here in the examples that I'm going to talk about is to construct an ignorance region in a nice sort of analytical way. Great. All right, so I'm going to consider 3 settings. Right. So 3 cases we're going to look at. The first one is where the factorization is non-unique. So that's to say that there are multiple factor models of this type that are consistent with the observed data, so that we could actually check whether we've achieved this conditional independence here. Right? And there are multiple different models that can achieve this conditional independence. Right? So if you think about the fact that, say, you can have a factor model that's identified up to scale or up to rotation, right? That's one of these non-unique cases. All right, the second one is where we have a unique factor model. And after we observe the causes A, our distribution of the unobserved confounder is non-degenerate. So that means that there's still some residual variation in the unobserved confounder after we've observed the causes A. The third one is going to be when we think about P of U given A being degenerate. Right? So that means that after we've observed all our inputs, let's say after we've observed the set of SNPs, we actually know exactly which sort of subpopulation the person came from. Right? After we observe all our causes, we know exactly what the latent variable was. All right. So let's dive into this example here. Okay. So this is, I think, one of the most canonical examples for thinking about causal inference problems in terms of these sorts of causal diagrams. Right? We're going to assume that everything in this diagram is Gaussian, right? And each of these arrows corresponds to a linear relationship between the source and the target. All right. So we're going to start at the sort of root of the tree. We're going to generate our unobserved confounder. And this is just going to be, here is distributed normally with some variance. Right? We're then going to generate our causes. And remember that we're looking at an m vector of causes here. Right? So we're going to have a vector alpha that multiplies u. And then we're going to add on some independent noise. Right? And here, our independent noise is, again, going to be now multivariate normally distributed. Right? And we'll just give it diagonal variance where the sort of scaling along the diagonal is parameterized by some parameter sigma a. Right? Final thing we'll look at is a scalar outcome y. And so y is going to be some linear combination of these a's. Right? It's going to be a linear combination of our causes plus a linear contribution from our unobserved confounder plus some residual noise. Right? And again, this is just going to be independent Gaussian noise with some sigma squared y. All right, so is this fair enough? All right, so all of the noise terms in this model are mean zero, right? And everything is multivariate Gaussian. So that means that we can characterize this entire system of variables just by its covariance matrix, right? So let's think about this covariance matrix here, right? And we can divide the covariance matrix up into blocks, right? That corresponds to, say, the variance of each of the individual variables, right? And then the cross covariance between different sets of variables, right? So I'm just going to sigma yy and then sigma ay, right? So this is a symmetric matrix. I'm just filling in the top part. OK, asking for some audience participation. Which portion of this covariance matrix is observable? OK, I'm seeing some people sort of pointing to this corner here, right? Yeah, so it's really nice, right? Multivariate normals. The marginal distributions, you can just read off of the joint distribution, right? So this portion of the covariance matrix is observable, right? Great. OK. So now, all right, we know what our observed data looks like now. Now, what is it that we're trying to pull out, right? What's the causal signal that we're trying to pull out? So, recall that the sort of causal graph that we care about is the one where we cut all of these edges here. So that would correspond to the case where we replace this line in our generating process, right? Instead of generating it as a function of u, we're just going to set this variable a to be lowercase a, right? Whatever a we care about. OK, and so what that means is that, if we look at the distribution of y given do a equals lowercase a, this is going to be distributed normally, right? And then we can sort of read off of this line how y is going to be distributed, right? So we're going to replace this capital A, this random variable a here, with a lowercase a. So it's going to be beta transpose a, right? If we're looking at the expectation, this is mean zero, so it goes away, right? And then these two things show up in the variance, right? So it's going to be plus, sorry, I need to make sure that I get my squareds right. Yeah. Gamma squared, sigma squared u plus sigma squared y, right? So in this example, I'm just going to focus on recovering the conditional mean, right, or the intervention distribution's mean. So that's basically this beta vector right here. Right? So Gaussians are very nice in the sense that we can reduce the entire causal inference problem to just recovering a specific parameter vector. All right, is the goal here clear so far? Great. OK. So we have these things that are observable, right? We have a set of structural parameters in these equations that we use to actually generate the data, right? So one thing that we can try to do is take these observable covariances and invert them so that we can recover, right, our parameter vector, or right, our sort of meta vector of parameters, alpha, beta, gamma, and then our 3 sigma squareds, right? Right. This is what we'd like to recover. And in particular, we don't really care if we get these things wrong. We just want to make sure that we recover a parameter vector, right, where beta has the right value. OK? All right, so we can expand each one of these covariance matrix terms, right, in terms of the structural parameters here, right? So for example, right, if we look at sigma AA, right, we know that this thing is going to be, right, we're just going to use all the rules that we maybe remember from our beginning probability class, right, about taking covariances of linear combinations of random variables, right? And so this sigma AA is going to look like this plus, right, our diagonal sigma squared A. So essentially here, this is the contribution coming from taking the linear transformation of U, right? And then this here is the contribution from the independent noise, right? Similarly, if we look at sigma AY, right, we're going to get something like sigma AA times beta plus, right? So this is the contribution, right? So here we're looking at the contribution from this term here, right? Just linear combination of A's, right? And then for the covariance, yeah, now we're going to get gamma times sigma squared U times alpha. Right? OK, and so I could also write out sigma YY, but this will get tedious, right? But you can see that essentially we end up with a system of equations. Left-hand side is observables. Right-hand side are these unobservable parameters that we'd like to recover. OK. So does anybody know what the problem is with this particular model, or where the indeterminacy lies? If you have a sort of multivariate Gaussian model like this with a hidden factor, what part of this model is not identified? Okay, I just thought I'd throw that out there. Right? It's sort of a well-known property that in these models, the scale of the latent variable is not identified. Right? So like if you open up any confirmatory factor analysis book, right, it will say that essentially you have to set the scale. Right? If you read the sort of probabilistic Pca paper, right, they always set the latent variable to have scale 1. So usually, if you're just using one of these models to actually, right, just recover, say, the joint distribution of A, you don't care about that scale. Right? But it turns out that in the causal problem, you actually do care about the scale. Right? And so, right, what do I mean that the scale is unidentified? What I mean is that you can take this, this sigma squared here. You can divide it by any c squared. And you can multiply this vector alpha by that same c, right? And you'll end up with exactly the same distribution for this line here, right? Or exactly the same observable for this line. You can propagate that change through all of these different variables, and you're going to end up with, you will end up, something that looks like this, right? For every value of c, you can recover a parameter beta, or recover a parameter beta 1 that induces the exact same distribution on the observed data, but it has this form. Right. Times gamma sigma squared u, 1 over. All right, so for any valid constant c that we choose to scale the latent variable by, right, we end up with our causal parameter of interest being shifted by a function of that value c. Right? So that means that, right, any one of these beta 1 c's is equally supported by the observed data, right? And based on whatever choice we make about what this scaling of the latent unobservable variable is, right, we're going to end up with a different causal conclusion. All right, so let's take a look at sort of what that ends up looking like in a very simple example. So we're going to look at a simple example, or a simple instantiation of this problem, where we think about the beta vector as just being a constant vector, so all the components have the same value, and the alpha vector also being a constant vector. In that case, this shift that gets applied to beta, you can just think about it as a scaling, right? And so we can write down our ignorance region in terms of how much we're multiplying the true effect by. All right, so this is how we're going to set up our view of the ignorance region. Right, we have our unidentified latent scaling factor. So this is something that we choose arbitrarily. And then this is the effect multiplier. Right, so ideally, we would like to recover the truth. In this example, the way I generated it, the true latent scale is 1. All right, and so if we move that c around, right, we end up with an ignorance region that looks like this in terms of the effect multiplier. So right, there are some alarming things here. For example, the sign can change. Right? And so we can have, from the same data, right, an equally supported conclusion that the actual effect of the causes A has the opposite sign. We can also get up to almost, right, seeing or estimating that the causes have twice the effect that they actually do.
Alex, can you translate this into the context of GWAS, where the PCs do have this non-identifiability?
Yes, absolutely. Depending on the scale that you choose, right? So let's say that you translate right, the PCA model that you're using into like a probabilistic PCA framework, right? Then you can choose whatever scale you want for the latent variable in probabilistic PCA, and the effect sizes that you estimate in your GWAS are going to depend on that scale that you specify.
But in practice, we don't do that, right? In practice, we do the non-probabilistic version. We just throw them in as covariates in a linear model. Mm-hmm. How do these concerns relate to that?
So it depends on what the non-probabilistic version maps to in terms of the assumption about the latent variable. So I think that the assumption is that the scale of the latent variable is always 1. Is that right? I believe that that's the sort of like that PCA can be framed as the maximum likelihood solution to probabilistic PCA, or like the standard probabilistic PCA, which would mean that there's an arbitrary decision that the population structure should have scale 1 in that case. Yeah. So yeah, this is something to think about, right? Essentially, what it means is that you can still, right, you are still measuring a valid association, but right, your causal interpretation of the observed data is going to depend on how you think about that scaling. All right. Cool. Should we move on to the next one? Let's do this. Hopefully these will be a little bit quicker. I'm going to do less algebra now. All right. I left my pen over there. Cool. So the next two cases, I can actually bundle them together into a single example. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So the way you wrote it, you wrote like beta c is like beta c equals 1 plus some shift.
Yes.
But if I care about like the ratio of beta c over beta 1, that scales linearly with c. Like, because I mean, you have like some degeneracy or some scale invariance, but the way you wrote it in the end looked like some sort of an additive shift.
Yeah.
Is that somehow like the misleading notation? I'm not getting something.
So in a lot of cases, right, so essentially in this particular example, we can frame the additive shift as a multiplicative shift because like everything is just moving in one direction. In other cases, right, the direction of the actual parameter vector beta can change, right, if you have different settings of the parameters. And so it's not actually just a scaling, like in more complicated examples. And so that's why it has the additive structure. Great. OK. So now let's think about the case where maybe we're in a world where we actually think that we have a factor model that's unique. Right, so this is example 2. This is the other sort of canonical causal inference example, where instead of having everything be Gaussian, we now have everything be binary. All right, so we're going to think about our latent variable u as being generated Bernoulli with some probability pi u. So this is just a biased coin, right? We're going to have our causes being generated independently according to some probability Pca that is a function of u. And we're going to assume that these are also identical just to make things easier, right? So this is for each, right, k in 1 through n. Right, and then we're going to have our outcomes here, again, be Bernoulli, this time where the probability that y is equal to 1 is a function of both u and the vector of causes a. Right? So this might map even more closely to the sort of GWAS setting if we think about binarizing the way that we think about deviations from a reference genome. Right? So we can think about a as being equal to 0 if it's the same as the reference, and a equal to 1 if it deviates from the reference. I hope I'm actually using those words correctly. I am not a statistical geneticist. All right. So this is our model now. And what we are going to attempt to recover from this, I'm going to call it pi of y given due a. Right. So because y here is binary, we can summarize the entire distribution of y just in one number. Right? That's just the probability that it's equal to 1. There's a probability that y is equal to 1, given that we set a equal to lowercase a. OK. And the nice thing here is that because u is binary, right, the integral that I wrote out earlier for how to recover this, it's just a sum with two terms. Right? So it's going to be 1 minus pi u. That corresponds to the case where this is equal to 0. Right? And so we're going to take that, and we're going to evaluate this probability when u is equal to 0. That's py of 0, lowercase a. Right? And then we're going to do the same thing for py of 1, lowercase a. Right? It's just two terms in this sum. Great. OK, so this is what we're after. Now I'm going to make a couple of additional assumptions. I'm going to assume that m is at least 3. And I'm going to assume that this pa of u is a non-trivial function of u. And what that does is it ensures that our factor model is identified. Right? So under those assumptions, we can actually recover. If we observe p of a, we can recover the joint distribution of p of a and u. Right? OK, so we're now in the world where we have a unique factorization. All right. So after we observe a, what variation is left over in this system? Right? Essentially, we can identify p of a and u. We can also identify p of a and y, right? Because these are both observed. Right? So the leftover variation is essentially the covariation between u and y after we condition on a. Right? The nice thing is that u is binary, y is binary. So we can think about this joint distribution of u and y, given that A takes a particular value, as a 2x2 table. Right? So we have u is equal to 0, u is equal to 1, y is equal to 0, y is equal to 1. Right? And the margins of this table are constrained. Right? So this margin here is constrained by p of u given a is equal to lowercase a. Right? So I'm going to write these probabilities as pi of u given a. Right? So if we sum these rows, right, they need to add up to these. And then likewise, right, the columns are constrained by right, so we're going to do this, p of y given a. All right. So we have this 2x2 table. It's constrained in its rows, it's constrained in the columns, and it's constrained to sum to 1. Right? That's 3 constraints. 4 unknowns. Okay? So that means that there's 1 degree of freedom left over in this table. Right? For every value of a, there's 1 degree of freedom left over. So we're going to parameterize the degree of freedom by this lower right corner. We'll call it P11 of a. That is the joint probability that u is equal to 1 and y is equal to 1, given that a takes this particular value. Right? So you can think about P11 of a. It is like linearly related to the correlation between u and y conditional on a. Right? So if we set this, this value here is going to be constrained, right? Like it has to be smaller than the row margin and the column margin, right? But there's a valid range that this thing can move on. And if we set this particular value to something in that range, then it fixes the rest of the values in the table. Right? Great. OK, so we're going to look at a particular instantiation of this problem where we actually move this sensitivity parameter around. And we'll see what it does to our causal conclusions. All right. So in this example, I want to be able to plot it just along one dimension. Right? But right, this p of y given do a, right, it's a multi-dimensional function. Right? It has m-dimensional inputs. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to assume that this p of y, py of ua, is only a function of the sum of a. Right? So you can think about that as the number of SNPs that deviate from baseline. Right? OK. And so that's going to allow me to, right, basically that means that this pi of y given do a also only depends on the sum of a. All right? That lets me plot this thing in just one dimension. All right, so here's our causal parameter on the y-axis. Right? On the x-axis, we have the sum of the inputs. Right? So like this 0 here just corresponds to the vector of all 0 a's. Right? And then this 1 here, it's going to give you the same result whether you're looking at the 1 being in the first slot or the last slot. All right. So this is the true pi y given do a. Right? This is what we wish we could recover. All right. If we didn't listen in statistics class and decided that correlation was causation, this is what we would report. Okay? This is just p of y given a in the observed data. All right. And then these are the sets of conclusions that are compatible with the observed data. All right, so even though everyone's staring at this point right now, let's ignore it for a second. Right, let's look at, say, right, the case where we have one of our causes equal to 1. Right, in this case, the range of possible values corresponds to the case where we assume that there's a minimum correlation between y and u given a and a maximum correlation between y and u given a, right? And sort of basically the causal parameter that we care about is monotonic in that, right? So we can just vary it going across. So, right, this is our ignorance region at each one of these settings of the inputs. And you can see that it's non-trivial everywhere except for m equals 3. Right? So in this example, I cheated when I set up the parameters. And specifically, I set it up so that pa of 0 is equal to 1 minus pa of 1. What that ends up doing is when we look at the conditional distribution of u given a, when I set the parameters like that, it turns out that if the sum of a is equal to 3, this conditional distribution is equal to the marginal distribution. So if that happens to occur, then we end up with the confounding essentially canceling out, right? And so basically the only time that we're going to have a non-trivial ignorance region here is in the special case where correlation is actually equal to causation, right? Where the observed conditional distribution actually is equal to the intervention distribution, right? So in the paper, the way that I frame it is to say that, right, we're going to have a non-trivial ignorance region except in the trivial case, right, where we didn't have to think causally to begin with. Great. Okay, so I framed this by saying that, well, we have some residual variance left over in U, right? And essentially what's happening here is that we have to figure out how that residual variance in U covaries with Y, right? And because we can't observe U and Y together, we can't figure out sort of how to line up these latent variables U with the outcomes Y, right? It's sort of like a broken regression problem where you've lost the indices of your features, right? Okay, so what about the case where we have so much information about the latent confounder in our observed causes that we can just deterministically pull it back out? Right? In that case, we no longer have this residual variation to worry about, and so maybe we can do fine. So it turns out that in this example, we can do that if we set m to be large enough. Right? We can consistently, in the limit where m goes to infinity, estimate U. Right? And so like a very easy way to see that is that we can write the, for a unit that has a given set of causes A, right? We can write p hat of A as just, right, the average of all of the observed causes, right? And this is going to converge to p sub A of, right, the p sub A that corresponds to this value of the latent confounder U. So you could define an estimator, right, for any given unit, something like this, where you're just going to make a call whether p hat of A is above or below, right, the two sort of values that you've recovered from your sample. And you will always be able, right, up to label switching between 1 and 0, to figure out which one of these classes the unit that you have in hand corresponds to. Okay, so when this happens, this is a really nice phenomenon, right? Because it means that now we feel like we can actually, right, this confounder that was unobserved is now observable, and so maybe we can actually back out our causal effect. All right. So let's take a look at what actually happens in the space of causes when this consistency phenomenon happens. So again, we're dealing with a high-dimensional cause here, a high-dimensional vector A. So what I'm going to do is project it down into 2 dimensions, right? So I'm going to use a linear projection in 2 dimensions. Right? The first linear projection that I'm going to use is just to recover that p hat of A, right? Because that's just a linear function of A. The second linear projection that I'm going to use is just going to be orthogonal to this, right? So now for any number of causes that we're looking at, we can just represent it in 2 dimensions, right? So in the case where we only have 4 causes here, right, we can see that we're not really having much luck in terms of recovering what p hat of A is, right? But as we look at more and more causes, right, we start seeing that if your U is equal to 1, you start landing more on this side of the screen, right? If U is equal to 0, you land more on this side of the screen, right? If you start looking at a large number of causes, eventually, right, the U equals 0 and U equals 1 points are completely distinct from each other. Right? And so in fact, what we can do then is just draw a line, and we can classify whether something came from U equals 1 or U equals 0. So this is nice if we want to recover U. But now what happens when we try to evaluate this quantity here? Right? So let's assume that we're one of the red points. Right? So if we observe an A such that U hat of A is deterministically equal to 0, right, such that it maps to 0, then, right, we're always going to be on this left-hand side here. So how do we figure out how to evaluate this function py of 1a for any a that lands on that side of the line. Right? We never observe a blue point on this side of the line, so we have no way of figuring out how to populate this function here. Right? So this consistency property that allows us to recover u hat also loses the positivity property, right, that I mentioned before. All right, without positivity, we can't actually evaluate both of these outcome functions. And so what ends up happening in this case, right, is that the best that we can do is just guess that this is somewhere between 0 and 1. Right? OK, so when we do that, right, in the sort of limit, what ends up happening is we can evaluate this expression here, right, for the 1 minus pi u case, where like all of our data, right, is going to come from this particular case. So we can just plug in, right, y given a is equal to a. And then for this half of our sum, we can just plug in the interval 0, 1, right? So what it means is that in the limit where we actually are able to recover our latent confounder u, our ignorance region is going to have width pi u, right? And likewise, right, if we sort of converge on the other answer, our ignorance region is always going to have width 1 minus pi u. And so you can actually see that in the previous example. Right, if we go to the sort of edges of the screen here, right, even with only 6 causes, we see this phenomenon happening, where in this example, pi u was set to 0.7, or was set to 0.3. Right? And so as you move towards this side of the screen, where we become very certain that u is equal to 0, right, this interval width here converges to 0.3. Right? And then likewise, on this side here, the interval width converges to 0.7. Right? So this is something that you'll see even in finite samples. All right. So thus ends all of the analytical examples. This took a little bit longer than I was hoping to. I wanted to end on a more positive note, but right.
So I'm a little worried about time, actually, because
Okay.
we want to make sure you breakfast. So
Okay.
can you wrap up in just a minute or two?
Yeah.
And then there'll be discussion later.
Absolutely. OK. Right. So in this particular setting, where we're trying to recover causal effects, where there's unobserved confounding, we're trying to do it by looking at multiple causes at once. Right. No matter how we try to get information about u, we end up with indeterminacy. Right? We can't actually recover the causal effects in this particular setting. Right? If you don't know what the distribution of u is, if you do know what the distribution of u is, but there's still residual variation, if you know exactly what u is, right, in all of those cases, you can't actually recover the causal effects. So there are several different ways to think about, right, moving towards better causal estimates in this setting. Right? One of them is to start looking for proxy information for this u that is not a cause whose effect you're trying to estimate. Right? So if there are other variables that are generated by this u that are conditionally independent of the outcome, then in this setting here, you can sort of use the relationship between one of these causes and one of those proxy variables to recover causal effects. There's a really nice paper that I don't have the citation in this presentation right now. It's right in the conclusion of the paper that discusses exactly how you can get identification in that case. The second thing is to start thinking about sensitivity analysis seriously. Right? Basically to say, OK, maybe we can't actually recover a point estimate, given the assumptions and the data that we have right now, but sometimes an interval is good enough. Right? And so one thing that I am interested in doing is to take the sensitivity analysis in this paper that was used to say that methods don't work and to turn it into an actual method. One nice thing is that sensitivity analysis is something that you can apply after you fit your model to your data, so that, right, we could actually consider right, reporting something like this in a paper, right, where we report the purple line, that's what we observed, and we also report these intervals here, which correspond to the causal conclusions that one could come to after observing the purple line. So if any of you are interested in doing this, please come talk to me, because I'd love to actually turn these negative results into something useful. All right, that's it. I'm absolutely out of time. Thanks so much.